Well, I was not aware of the extra goodies happening tonight, so I'm going to start with my final point. Or maybe a few before that. But I got to say, my wife and my children and I, well, it comes down to this. It took me a long time to start a family, and I think God knew that we needed Miller Street. And they have been an incredible blessing to us. We have had a great time having the family here at Miller Street. And it's so encouraging to have all of you here tonight. I know we say that, but it's just nice to cross paths once in a while, but it's also just a good reminder that what the church is all about, what a cross-section of human beings that we would never have met otherwise, and what a blessing it is. So it's really appreciated that you took the time tonight. I know that you're very busy with all kinds of different responsibilities, so I thought I'd cover the possibility if any of you end up becoming king. I have a few things to go over with you that might be of use. When you become king, there's certain things that you need to do. Make sure this, okay. Number one, you need to make sure that your kingdom is secure. And I'm going to use David as kind of a template here. That's what David did. He made sure when he became a king, if you want to write these down just in case, if anybody's already king, I apologize, but this is what I came across. That's what David did in 2 Samuel 8:1. We realize that David defeated the Philistines. They were kind of a constant problem. I'm sure you're well aware of that. And he took over their capital and kind of hushed them down. And then in 2 Kings 8:2, we can read about how he defeated Moab. In fact, it was kind of strange. He had them lay down and kind of numbered them off and ended up ending about two-thirds of them. And then in 2 Samuel 8, starting with verse 3, you can read about how he took back control of the Euphrates River as a pretty strategic location. And in order to do that, 22,000 were killed by David. 2 Samuel 8:14, he stationed troops in Edom to kind of control that as well. So number one, if you become king, make sure your kingdom is secure. Number two, surround yourself with powerful people. That's a smart move as well if you become king. David, again, 2 Samuel 8:15, he surrounded himself with some pretty intimidating guys. If you're paying attention, I know sometimes when you're reading, you see these lists, but they pop up again here and there. One guy in particular that kind of jumps out is Joab. He worked with David, worked for him, but he was known for being a merciless killer. He did some things that were pretty brutal. And then Benaiah, he shows up again later under Solomon's payroll, I guess, and he's kind of the royal assassin. If somebody needs to be taken care of, they send Benaiah. So we've got this king to-do list, and you want to make sure that your kingdom is secure, and you need to surround yourself with powerful people, but don't forget number 3, kill all the princes. And this is standard procedure for a king, whether it be biblical or secular history. Eliminate the competition, especially a competing family. Herod did not make the distinction. He went after his own family. But if you want to keep the throne and there's a competing family and contending for that, you need to extinguish that lineage. If you don't, you might regret it. They could grow up and become itchy for the throne, because princes want to become king. They might come and try to kill you. There's a prince to-do list. It's take the throne, number 1. According to 2 Samuel 8, like I mentioned, David was surrounding himself with some pretty intimidating guys. We have Joab, who worked for David, and as I mentioned, there's an account in the Bible, we won't get into it now, where he just was so brutal. And just a merciless guy. And then Benaiah, this royal assassin guy. Well, right after mentioning these guys, the Bible tells us that David asked a question. He asked, is there anybody left in Saul's family? And I'm sure you remember how Saul had gone to great lengths to try and kill David. For a long time, David's life was get up, run from Saul, go to sleep. Get up, run from Saul, go to sleep. That was his life. Now, with Joab and Benaiah and others standing in the shadows behind him, David asks the question, is there anybody left in Saul's family? If I was a member of Saul's family and I heard that question, I would be a little worried. I would fast track my bucket list and make sure my house is in order. Clearly the plan is to do what kings do, exterminate the opposition. But when you read the whole question, you'll see a shocking truth. And yet again we see David distinguishing himself. 2 Samuel 9:1, here's the whole question. Is there anybody left in Saul's family that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? And so we discover something very important about David. Even though he was no stranger to warfare, David is not your typical king. He's ready to show mercy. And you know, Jonathan, Saul's son, had been David's best friend. And so David wants to know if any of Jonathan's relatives are left. Is there anybody? Anybody left? But instead of hunting them down to kill them, he's hunting them down to help them. So we read in 2 Samuel 9:2. Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David. And the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, "I am your servant." And the king said, "Is there not yet anyone of the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God?" And it turns out there is. There's one guy. 2 Samuel 9:3, and Ziba said to the king, "There's still a son of Jonathan who's crippled in both feet." And so natural question, where is he? He lives in this town called Lo-Debar. That's mentioned in 2 Samuel 9:4. That's where he is. And so in 2 Samuel 9:5, King David tells his guys to go get him. Go find this guy. I don't know if this guy who lived in Lo-Debar knew what was coming. I don't know if he was just living his life or if he got a heads up about what was coming. It must have been somewhat frightening to be summoned to face the king who was responsible for the death of many men. This guy's name is Mephibosheth. I bet some of you have heard of him. And he was brought to the king, and he drops to the ground in front of David, and he says in 2 Samuel 9:6, Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and prostrated himself. And David said, "Mephibosheth," and he said, "Here is your servant." At this point, Mephibosheth probably is just hoping to be allowed to live, but that is not the plan. 2 Samuel 9:7, David said to him, "Do not fear, for I will surely show kindness to you for the sake of your father Jonathan, and will restore you to all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you shall eat at my table regularly." He's not going to kill Mephibosheth. He's not even going to let him go back to what he was before. He's going to restore the land that he lost, and he's going to make sure he has a spot at the table, at the king's table. So Mephibosheth obviously did not expect this at all. Far better than he hoped for. He's not just going to live, he's going to have a good life. Totally goes against his expectations. 2 Samuel 9:8, listen to his reaction here. Again, he prostrated himself and said, "What is your servant that you should regard a dead dog like me?" He recognizes his position. He deserves nothing. In the grand scheme of things, he's a dog. And not just a dog, a dead one. Dead dogs aren't that useful. They only know one trick. I bet you know what they are, what it is. But Mephibosheth, up to this point, was not living a very good life. He's physically limited, of course, and he's on the losing team. And he lived in Lo-Debar. Some towns mean something. I bet maybe you know your hometown's meaning. It was not my hometown, but when I was about in first or second grade, we lived in Sylacauga, Alabama. And my dad was curious and decided to look up what it meant. What does Sylacauga mean? It means buzzard roost. That's what it means. We never saw a buzzard there, but Lo-Debar also has a meaning too as well. If you were to have lived back then and lived in Lo-Debar, you would have known the meaning of this town. It literally meant nothing. Or as we would say, it was the middle of nowhere. For Mephibosheth, he was a nobody living in the middle of nowhere. Life was a big zero. And David says, nope, that's not how it's going to be anymore. Things are about to get a whole lot better. And it turns out that Mephibosheth had some land, but he lost it during the turnover of power. And so David makes arrangements to give him the land back. And he even sets up guys to work it for him, to work the land, and so that he'll be secure. And finally, he makes sure that Mephibosheth has a spot at his table. And a spot at the table is a big deal. 2 Samuel 9 11, notice a little detail here. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table as one of the king's sons. So he's not breaking even here at all. It's a major upgrade. He's not just rescued, he's sustained and improved. He's actually safe and sound in the palace, sitting at the table of the king who was once his enemy and is now treating him as if he were his own son. That turned out to be a really good day. He's not going to die. He's not going back to nothing town. In fact, life is going to be a lot better, which is crazy when you consider David's reputation. There was actually a pop song back then, very famous during that time. 1 Samuel 18, verse 6, it happened as they were coming when David returned from killing the Philistine. This is back before when Saul was still alive. That the women came out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. The women sang as they played, and they said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And it was a song. And it was so popular, it caught on. Later on, the Philistines heard about it, and the tune made them nervous. 1 Samuel 29:5, they're talking amongst themselves. Is it David, right? Is this not David of whom they sing in the dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s? It's making them nervous. Everybody knew this song. I bet even in Lodabar. And it makes you wonder, while Mephibosheth was on his way to Jerusalem, if that catchy tune was in his head. Killing 10,000 enemies just another day in the life of King David. What would be 10,001? But David broke the rules. He didn't do things like the world. Yes, he defeated armies and armies, but he was ready to show mercy. Even more than just mercy, he didn't just provide for Mephibosheth, he raised him to a position of privilege, something Mephibosheth did not deserve. Now, there's some other details about this man, but I'm going to leave it at that, and let's focus on David. Obviously, we're focusing on him as a man after God's own heart. That's how God thought of him, even before he was deeply into the game. He's talking about him, and in 1 Samuel 13:14 says, the Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart. What a compliment that would be for somebody to tell you you're a person after God's own heart. And what that basically means is someone who is really trying to do what God wants him to do. He does things the way God would. So, maybe it's not a reach to suggest that when we see the good in David, we can also learn more about the nature of God. And in this case, David showed mercy. And I think it was very much how God shows mercy. In fact, what we see with David and Mephibosheth, I think we can find with us and God. Very similar situations. According to standard procedure, we should die. It's easy to think, somebody said this not long ago, and it really struck me. It's easy to think that the sacrifice of Jesus saves us from Satan, but the truth is a little more startling than that. The sacrifice of Jesus actually saves us from God. Here's Romans 5:10. Much more than having now been justified by his blood, we shall be saved from the wrath of God through him. For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. The sacrifice of Jesus saves us from the wrath of God. Up until that point, we're not in a good spot. We are enemies. Romans 8:7 says the mindset on the flesh is hostile toward God. You don't break even. It's not a neutral position. If we cut ourselves loose from God, there is no middle ground. James 4:4. You adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is hostility toward God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. God is just. And justice means that the punishment fits the crime. And the law of sin and death says the wages of sin is death. That is the appropriate response to sin. Now, world thinking will tell you things like this. You deserve to be happy. Actually, not true at all. You deserve to be executed. Just like Mephibosheth, in a very real way, in the grand scheme of things, we are nothing more than dogs. I bet you recall in Matthew 7 when that woman approaches Jesus and she kind of humiliates herself. And she compares herself to a dog, and Jesus treats her with kindness. But she was kind of onto something. When we begin to understand the goodness of our King and how not good we are, a dog is an appropriate image. 2 Timothy 2:20, for if after they have escaped the defilements of the world by the knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, they are again entangled in them and are overcome. The last state has become worse for them than the first. For it would be better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than having known it, to turn away from the holy commandment handed on to them. It has happened to them according to the true proverb, a dog returns to its own vomit. Maybe a dead dog would be better. We're not dead dogs, we're worse. We're disgusting dogs. Our culture, of course, has given dogs better PR. We have a dog too, and more like one of the family. But not back then. They were scavengers. In fact, it was kind of well known if you died in the country and you were left to be, it was the birds that removed you. If you died in the city, it was the dogs. Jezebel could vouch for that. And even now, there is a basic nature to a dog that's still there. There's actually, I got to visit Scotland years ago, and I remember back then at least there was one town that was having trouble with animal control, and a very domesticated kind dog would meet another domesticated kind dog, and they would form packs, and their nature would change. And we're a lot like that. Left to our own devices, we have no self-control, no self-respect, and like dogs, we can end up living lives just responding to our surroundings with no real thought, no real self-control. Something's in front of us, we make the decision that requires the least effort. When we get in a group of dogs, our behavior gets even worse. Mob mentality's notorious. I'm sure you've heard about that. And I mean this as a collective insult. When it comes to any goodness, we are all dogs. And just like Mephibosheth, without God, when you look your life over, things aren't good. We have a tendency to make choices that set up a descent, a road that truly leads nowhere. Romans 1:21, for even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile, and their speculations and their foolish heart was darkened. Cutting loose from God is movement into darkness. In Romans 1:24, therefore God gave them over in the lust of their heart to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. When we're in charge, we have a tendency to run our lives into the ground. Romans 1:28. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do those things which are not proper. It's a progressive degradation. Dogs going nowhere. Now, the world can make you feel like you're accomplishing something. If you got enough busyness and dollars, you can create the illusion, and it might feel like life is good, but it's going nowhere. We all know what Ecclesiastes says in 1:14, I have seen all the works which have been done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and striving after wind. We know what it says, but we don't believe it, but it's true. All the things we're doing, if it's without God, it's all a waste of time. This one's not as familiar. It's in Haggai chapter 1, verse 5. See if this doesn't hit the nail on the head. Consider your ways. You have sown much, but harvest little. You eat, but there's not enough to be satisfied. You drink, but there's not enough to become drunk. You put on clothing, but no one is warm enough. And he who earns wages to put into a purse with holes. The more you try, the less you have. And interestingly enough, Mephibosheth's hometown is mentioned again in the book of Amos, but for spiritual reasons. God uses this town to make a spiritual point. Amos 6:1. He's talking about some people, and he says, woe to those who are at ease in Zion. And when I notice and remember that Hebrews uses Zion in connection with the church, I pay closer attention to this. Amos 6:4. Those who recline on beds of ivory and sprawl on their couches. And then he says this, you who rejoice in Lo-Debar. You know what he's saying. You who rejoice in nothing. Mephibosheth isn't the only one living in nothing town. Without your king, you are nobody in the middle of nowhere. No hope, no chance of a real life. It'll be life, and you'll create the illusion everything's fine, but unless you're right with God, it will be exactly like Mephibosheth before King David. So, I tell you all this stuff. It's important to know how bad things are and how bad things could get before we can appreciate what can happen instead. Even though we are nothing and have nothing, just like David, God has mercy for us. He doesn't just rescue us, he lifts us up. And like David, he searches for those he can do good for. This is one of my favorite verses, 2 Chronicles 16:9. For the eyes of the Lord move to and fro throughout the earth, that he may strongly support those whose heart is completely his. He's looking and he's looking. Who can I bless? Who can I show kindness? Just like David, is there anyone to whom I can show kindness? And he doesn't just sustain us, he lifts us up. We don't just have life, we have better than life. John 10:10, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. We're just like Mephibosheth. And I've got some very good news for you. Things are not going to turn out the way you think, or even the way you hoped. Ephesians 3:20, now to him who is able to do far more abundantly, beyond all that we ask or think, according to the power that works within us. When you become a Christian, you become part of the king's family. And just like Mephibosheth, we sit at the king's table. We're in a position of safety and privilege. It's easy to miss. Jesus is your brother. That's what it's talking about in Hebrews 2:11. For both he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified are all from one Father, for which reason he is not ashamed to call them brethren. When you become a Christian, you are with the king. You're like one of his children, safe and sound. Hopefully there comes a point for all of us, a point in your life where you kind of stop and think and essentially say, I don't want to be a dog anymore. Just reacting to my surroundings, scavenging, becoming less and less of who I used to be. I want life to be made of days that matter. If you're a Christian, you're at the king's table, and now you can start living life. Notice how he puts it in Revelation 3:20. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and will dine with him, and he with me. You and I don't deserve anything, but we get to have everything. I think it's kind of fun to imagine, this is just conjecture, speculation. I think it's kind of fun to imagine Mephibosheth after he started living in the palace. When he woke up that first morning, probably a little strange. Say, wait a second, this isn't nowhere. Maybe the first time sitting at the table, possible tension, maybe more forks than he's used to dealing with, trying to be at his best. I think after living in Lo-Debar in nowhere town for so long, I imagine it was kind of hard to totally relax. See, back in nowhere town, when he heard David was in power, I wonder if he wondered, is today the day when my life ends with a sword? So even after he moved into the palace, I bet it was probably hard to relax. Probably took some time for the tension to go away. But after eating at the king's table, and after a few days, maybe he woke up one morning and finally realized everything's all right. I want that for me. I want that for you. I think sometimes we're in the palace. We're safe and sound, but we still haven't let go of that tension and realize that that other life in nowhere town, that's gone. That's somebody else. And we're robbing ourselves of the peace that we get to go in and have breakfast and not be worried at all. I'm in the palace, protected by the very one who has every right to end me. I like to think that eventually Mephibosheth slept really well, and I would like to think that you will too. Of course, it's very important to make sure that everything's all right with your king. But if you're a Christian, you are safe and sound at the king's table. So tomorrow morning, when you get up, it's important to remember that everything is absolutely all right. Hope this is encouraging to you while we stand together and sing.